And without further ado, I'd like to welcome A.E. Stallings to the stage.
It's good to be back in the land of the living. I still owe a cockerel to Asclepius, but otherwise doing much better. I'm going to talk today about rhyme. Rhyme as a method of composition, but also rhyme as a method of revision. I think a lot of people think that rhyme is some kind of ornament that is added afterwards. You're sort of decorating what you have to say. No, it is the method. Maybe all writing is groping forward in the dark. We learn by going where we have to go. Poets, perhaps, though, even more so than other writers, travel by sound, by emitting sounds and listening by echolocation. In this way, and in many others, they are like bats. The sound that most obviously calls out to sound is rhyme. It is the most obvious and controversial of poetic sound effects. I will add that a second way in which poets are like bats. Bats, unlike birds, cannot lift themselves off the ground in flight. They cannot get lift off the ground. So bats have to climb up to a height and fall upside down into the air, into the darkness. Keats calls this negative capability. I'm going to start with a poem that is rhymed and that is about bats, and I think maybe a little bit about composition also. Mind by Richard Wilbur. Mind in its purest play is like some bat that beats about in caverns all alone, contriving by a kind of senseless wit not to conclude against a wall of stone. It has no need to falter or explore. Darkly it knows what obstacles are there, and so may weave and flitter, dip and soar in perfect courses through the blackest air, and has this simile alike perfection. The mind is like a bat, precisely, save that in the very happiest intellection, a graceful error may correct the cave. Before I go into how rhymes connect, it occurs to me probably I should go over some kinds of rhymes. We have perfect rhymes where all sounds from the last stressed syllable will match up. These also then can be divided into masculine rhymes, feminine rhymes, and dactylic rhymes. I have been in discussions online where people got all upset about the gender of these rhymes. Just let me establish that it's to do with grammatical gender, not with gender. So there's nothing innately feminine about a feminine rhyme or innately masculine about a masculine rhyme. This just comes out of grammar things, particularly from the French. So a masculine rhyme, it tends to be things like work, lurk, kind of on that rising sound. Feminine rhymes, nothing to do with gender. Bridal, title, fertile, myrtle, etc. And then dactylic, and obviously dactyl is not a gender, I don't think. Rapidly and vapidly, for instance. So these are all perfect rhymes. Then there are para-rhymes, which is a kind of very specific consonantal rhyme in which both sides of the syllable match up, but there is slippage with the vowel. Groined and groaned is one, cut and cat is another. Consonantal slant rhymes or off rhymes, heart and shirt. So the final consonants match up, but the vowel does not. The vowel is algebraic. It can be anything, it can be X, and I like to think of it as the third of a chord because often with a para rhyme, there's a vowel shift, and vowels have pitch to them a little bit, so like it might be kind of going down or it might be kind of going up. Now, if you have a word that ends on a vowel, any of those can rhyme together. I rhyme enough and plow. Presumably at some point enough and plow actually rhymed, but now they don't. They just rhyme in the I. Grandfathered in rhyme. I have kind of made this up, but it's a thing. It counts as perfect rhyme, but it isn't. So love, move, and prove, they count. Conceptual rhyme, those are really fun. You could have opposite rhymes where up rhymes with down. There are palindromic rhymes, there are anagrammatical rhymes. Penultimate rhyming is quite obscure. Merrill's The Octopus is the only example. I invite you to look at it. Rhyme riche or homophonic rhyme is, time and time, where they're spelled differently. They are two different things, but they sound the same. If I am rhyming time and time, which is not really a rhyme, it is an identity. There are leonine rhymes, mosaic rhymes, skewed rhymes. Assonance, where only the vowels match up, like pike and type, I don't count as a rhyme. It is a very important sound effect and rhyme in languages like Spanish, but in English, I think you can only get away with it in certain kinds of maybe very casual or performative settings. You can argue with me about that later. Rhyme is a metaphor for simile. Rhyme is a simile for metaphor. Rhyme is itself a kind of simile. You are saying this is like that. Why? Because they sound the same. Rhyme is the reason. So it suggests some kind of connection, family relationship, a quantum entanglement between two words. We think about, mathematical equations, sentences that are equations, but there are also mathematical sentences that are inequalities. This is greater than that. This is less than that. Rhymes kind of like to have inequality as well as the fact that they are equating each other. I will say that rhyme is local to a language. It is a kind of terroir. So in English, we happen to have certain rhyme pairs that maybe have guided our literature: womb and tomb, fire and desire, breath and death. Love, though, what have we got? We've got of, above, dove, glove. And then, we grandfather in, move, and prove. But, in another language, there will be different essential pairs that will become very important in sonnets and so forth. We should add that Western languages all pretty much derive rhyme out of Arabic. And as I said, rhyme is not ornament, it is a method of composition. We want our rhymes to be dynamic. Again, the heat death of the universe would be if there is no movement because everything is kind of like the same temperature. I'm not a physicist, you can correct me later. So equilibrium is static. If you want energy being the ability to do work, you need inequalities. So even though you're saying with a rhyme, this equals this, you don't want them to be flat and exact. If you have cat, hat, mat, bat, you're going to have a very flat kind of rhyme because A, they're all monosyllables and they're all nouns, and that also tells me something about the rather clumsy end-rhymed syntax of such a poem. So when you're thinking about how to make your rhymes more dynamic, we want to rhyme across parts of speech. We want to rhyme between or among monosyllabic and polysyllabic words, rhymes between or among abstract and concrete, between brand names and generic, between specific and vague, between or among words of different registers or etymological sources, and so on. You can tell a lot about a poem, a rhymed poem, by simply looking at the rhymes, and we're going to look at a couple. This is a wonderful Emily Dickinson poem, which is about exactly what we're talking about, rhyming our way out of the dark. We grow accustomed to the dark when light is put away, as when the neighbor holds the lamp to witness her goodbye. A moment, we uncertain step for newness of the night, then fit our vision to the dark and meet the road erect. And so of larger darknesses, those evenings of the brain when not a moon disclose a sign or star come out within. The bravest grope a little and sometimes hit a tree directly in the forehead. But as they learn to see, either the darkness alters or something in the sight adjusts itself to midnight and life steps almost straight. We see in this a lot of Emily Dickinson's trademark things. She's in ballad meter, so tetrameter, trimeter, tetrameter, trimeter. She is not bothering to rhyme the ones and the threes, only the twos and the fours. She is following, as much as she knows or is able to, the standards of rhyme that she would find in a hymn book in the 19th century. So vowels can rhyme with any other vowel, away and goodbye. Night and erect are both meeting up in the T, and maybe even there's a suggestion of, the older pronunciation of night, nicht, and erect, if you think of it that way. It's also kind of a sight rhyme as well as a slant rhyme. Brain and within both end with a vowel and an N, in fact, an I-N. Tree and sea is a full rhyme. And sight and straight is a slant rhyme and also an I rhyme. But these all follow the standards as she understands them from a 19th century hymnal. But let's look at what's rhyming with what. Put away, that's sort of adverbial, with goodbye, which is a noun, but also kind of an abstract noun that's turned into a thing. Night, a noun, it rhymes with erect, which is adjectival. Brain, a noun, rhymes with within, which I think here is adverbial. You can all correct me afterwards. Tree and sea are the pure rhymes, and I love it. That's that obvious stanza where you get hit in the head with the tree is where we have the full rhymes. But it is a noun with a verb and an infinitive verb. Sight is a noun here with straight, which is more adjectival but predicative, and a little bit slant. It's almost straight. So you can see how the rhymes themselves are feeling their way forwards. And then there's even a sort of bonus rhyme, midnight, which does not count in the scheme, but which is in there between sight and straight. Midnight kind of looms in the middle. You can X-ray a poem by its rhymes. You will know this poem. Know, though, here, snow, queer, near, lake, year. Shake, mistake, sweep, flake, deep, keep, sleep, sleep. You will know this poem, but let's look for a moment just at the rhymes. We have here a particular stanza form of rhyme. It is a rubaiyat, but these are also linked rubaiyats. Rubaiyat is the Arabic and Persian for quatrain. It simply means 4 lines of 4, like a quatrain. But let's look at what kinds of rhymes. Are we going to rhyme across various parts of speech? What's going on here? One thing I can look at is they're all monosyllables with one exception. And what is that? Mistake. That is a very large word when we look at just the skeletal X-ray of this poem. So know is a verb, though adverb. Snow is a noun. Here, adverb queer, maybe adjectival, near adverb, year, a noun, lake, a noun, a physical object, place, rhyming with shake, a noun but a movement, mistake, a 2-syllable abstract noun, flake, noun, physical object, sweep, noun, movement, which rhymes with deep, adjective, keep, verb in the infinitive, sleep, verb, sleep, verb. So you see that there's quite a lot of things that are going on just in the parts of speech. That tells me that the syntax is going to be interesting. I'm going to talk a bit about this poem. I know we all think we know everything there is about this poem, and you may know more about this poem than I do. But one of the things I like about it is we know quite a lot about how it came to be. So I can kind of run my rhyme experiment on it. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. That also works. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So we feel we know this poem quite well. Let's talk a little bit about how this poem came to be. We might also notice that mistake is a very large word. There is one word in the poem that is larger than mistake. Anybody? Evening is also a good one. Promises. Promises is even bigger than mistake, but it's not a rhyme word. We might consider, although the poem is titled Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, it is written not on the darkest evening of the year at the winter solstice, but in June of 1922 at dawn. That kind of emerging out of the dark and thinking about the darkness of the solstice, of the winter solstice. So that's something to consider about it, about its making. That it's a recollection of darkness as the dawn is coming up. And it is written after a night of productive composition on his long blank verse poem, New Hampshire. I don't know if you've recently read New Hampshire. It's okay. It's very folksy, and it's very faux folksy, and it's all those kind of Robert Frost things that kind of make you cringe a little bit. And it ends, well, if I had to choose one or the other, I'd choose to be a plain New Hampshire farmer with an income in cash of, say, $1,000 from, say, a publisher in New York City. It's restful to arrive at a decision and restful just to think about New Hampshire. At present, I am living in Vermont. I mean, it's charming, it's conversational, it's in blank verse. And he wrote all night, not struggling to write. He was productively writing this thing all night. And then he sort of gets up from his desk, looks at the dawn, and this other poem comes swirling in. And it comes, he says, almost as if in a hallucination. He writes it in one go and makes very few changes. Let's look a little bit at some of these rubaiyats. So the rubaiyats he would have been thinking of and was, completely soaked in was the very famous rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, translated by Edward Fitzgerald. It would have been in every single household. Probably he has the 5th edition, which is about 30 years old at this time. I'm just going to read you some random rubaiyats. They are not connected. So it's rhyme, rhyme, unrhyme, rhyme. Rhyme, rhyme, unrhyme, rhyme, and there's no connection. They're just separate individual quatrains like epigrams. Come, fill the cup, and in the fire of spring your winter garment of repentance fling. The bird of time has but a little way to flutter, and the bird is on the wing. You probably know that. You certainly know this one, a book of verses underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness. Oh, wilderness were paradise, and now. Enough. And here's a random one. They say the lion and the lizard keep the courts where Jarmshid gloried and drank deep, and Bahram, that great hunter, the wild ass, stamps o'er his head but cannot break his sleep. I think we kind of recognize that trio of rhymes, which I would say is purely coincidental, or maybe not purely. So we do know something about this poem. Besides, here we have the original rough draft, or a facsimile of the original rough draft, where we have the last three syllables, the stanzas rather. What he says about the first stanza is it came entirely to him. It came exactly the way it is. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. He says, that went off so easily, I was tempted into the added difficulty of picking up my 3 for my 1, 2, 4 to go on with the second stanza. He's going to link the rubaiyats. As far as I know, I don't know of any other examples before this poem of linked rubaiyats. Please correct me afterwards if you do know. And then he says, I was amused and scared at what that got me into. So the rhyme shooting out from the third line that is then going to start composing the next stanza, he says it amuses him and it scares him of what kind of difficulty he's going to get himself into. So this is that kind of rhyme feeling its way forward as a kind of composition. So we see what we have here. There are some changes. It's a memory that he's thinking of in June of some early Christmas time where he was headed home, but he had not picked up presents for the children. This is, maybe on a literal level what these promises are. And that would be a very different poem. It could be a kind of poem written in that New Hampshire folksiness. And I forgot to pick up the presents, blah, blah, blah. But that's not what happens here because the rhyme has other ideas. Originally, he has it, because he's coming from a memory, they're a pair of horses. This would also be a different poem if it were still a pair of horses. So that's from the actual anecdote. And originally, he has something like the steaming horses think it queer. Then he tinkers with it. He says the horse begins to think it queer. And that doesn't work either. And then he says the little horse. And then it becomes my little horse. That horse later, he's not sure about the gender. Here he's decided is it a she, is it a he, who gives the harness bells a shake. He alters between a forest and a lake becomes the line that it is now. Between the woods and frozen lake, which I think is, better. It's an improvement. But what happens that's the most mysterious thing about this poem and where it rises into its kind of greatness is the final stanza, the final rubaiyat. You'll notice here that he says the woods are lovely, dark, and deep. There's no commas whatsoever. I know we've argued about the commas, but in this original, it's just one. But I have promises to keep. Now, the third line is supposed to rhyme with something else. And what do you do with it? Does it keep pulling you on? So he originally has, but I have promises to keep that bid me give my reins a shake. Okay, that's a problem because we've already had shake, we've already had reins. Do we then go on to another ache kind of stanza? So he's like, that doesn't work. Then bids me on, and there are miles. Miles. So what kind of happens is, if you see, he has the fourth line already. The fourth line exists, and miles to go before I sleep. But instead of, building another stanza, he's like, what if that also is the third line? So the fourth line is written before the third line, and then the third line is the fourth line repeated. And that's kind of the magic that the form has led him into. Oops. I want to go backwards. So, and he writes to Untermeyer later, he says, this is my bid. He says, he calls this poem several times, like the short poem with the long title, and then he writes to Untermeyer and he says, stopping by woods on a snowy, etc., my best bid for remembrance. We'll look at another Frost poem, Design, which is a sonnet that I love, also written in 1922. And here we're going to look at rhyme as a method of revision. Here is the poem in its greatness as we know it. I found a dimpled spider, fat and white, on a white heel all, holding up a moth like a white piece of rigid satin cloth, assorted characters of death and blight, mixed ready to begin the morning right, like the ingredients of a witch's broth, a snowdrop spider, a flower like a froth, and dead wings carried like a paper kite. What had that flower to do with being white, the wayside blue and innocent heal all? What brought the kindred spirit to that height, then steered the white moth thither in the night? What but design of darkness to appall, if design govern in a thing so small? Another reminder, as Randall Jarrell says, of how dark Frost is. He's one of our darkest poets. I love to show, we have an earlier version of this from a letter where it has not achieved its perfection. I like to show this to people when talking about revision because it is a mediocre poem and it has been revised into this. This is what we have. Oops, this is, design. Where is my, early unpublished version. And here, if you're following along, I have bolded the lines that he doesn't change, and I have highlighted the lines that are altered. A dented spider, like a snowdrop white, on a white heel all, holding up a moth, like a white piece of lifeless satin cloth, saw ever curious eye so strange a sight? Portent in little, a sordid death and blight, like the ingredients of a witch's broth, the beady spider, the flower like a froth, and the moth carried like a paper kite. What had that flower to do with being white? The blue prunella, every child's delight. What brought the kindred spider to that height? Make we no thesis of the miller's plate. What but design of darkness and of night? Design, design, do I use the word aright? So there are good things in here. It took me years to understand what the miller's plight was. I thought it had something to do with Chaucer, but miller is a kind of moth, so it's the plight of the moth. The moth is a miller's moth. So what are some of the changes? We can look, if we do kind of an X-ray, you can see the original. We have 2 rhyme sounds. White, mothcloth, sight, blight, broth, froth, kite, white, delight, height, plight, night, aright. 13 out of 14 of them are nouns, I believe. We have 2 that are 2 syllables. So we only have 2 rhyme sounds. They're almost all nouns and almost all monosyllables. What happens just in terms of the rhyme? We burst out into a 3rd rhyme sound, and we get more things across speech. White, mothcloth, blight, right is not there as a noun. Broth, froth, kite, white, heal all is specific, and it's a new rhyme sound. Height, night, appall is an infinitive verb, and then we have small, which is an adjective. So we have multiplied our parts of speech by quite a lot. But I think also, just in terms of what is the poem about, it is about 3 things that have come together into an awful conjunction. And we go from 2 rhyme sounds to 3 rhyme sounds. So that seems to better suit also the poem. So here are where he's made the changes. And so different from, there is no I in the poem until the very last line. But now we start the poem with I found in that kind of imperative, narrative, storytelling tense, which puts the reader into a kind of trance. I'm listening to someone who has found a spider, a dimpled spider. And we don't have that kind of archaic, a snowdrop white, which sounds very Victorian. Instead, we have the simpler, I found a dimpled spider, fat and white. Portent in little is not a bad phrase, but assorted characters is better. Mixed ready to begin the morning right is that kind of really icky, cheerful creepiness that the poem has, being about creepy things that are in this color of white. Like the ingredients of a witch's broth, a snowdrop spider instead of a beady spider. So he still gets the snowdrop in, but now it is describing the spider more directly, a snowdrop spider. And then instead of the blue prunella, every child's delight, we have that much more idiomatic and moving the wayside blue and innocent heal all. We get to have night in here in a different sense. We have then steered the white forth thither in the night. And that's such a wonderful verb. I can hear the moth thithering, thither. And then we have this wonderful paradox. What but design of darkness to appall? To appall is to make something white. So the darkness has whitened this and also appalled us. And then we have, because we've allowed the third rhyme sound to be reaching out into the darkness, we get something much more profound. If design govern in a thing so small. Frost was very concerned about things like evolution and design and, is there a God or, is this all a mechanical universe? But also now this becomes about the sonnet itself. The thing so small is the spider, but it is also the sonnet, which quite clearly is governed by design. I thought we would look at this poem, In a Dark Time. So we have, again, a rhymed poem about darkness. It harkens back in some ways both to the Emily Dickinson poem and a little bit, although Wilbur can't help but be cheerful even in darkness, to the mind. We have this cave, which we associate with bats, and which we associate with Plato. And Theodore Rothke here, this has a lot to do with maybe Plato as well. We are in a new kind of fun rhymed stanza. Again, we saw how Frost, by challenging himself to the Rubaiyat and then giving him the idea of, I'm going to actually link the Rubaiyats, comes up with a new poem. Rothke sits down and thinks, what happens if I write in the Venus and Adonis stanza of Shakespeare? In a dark time. In a dark time, the eye begins to see. I meet my shadow in the deepening shade. I hear my echo in the echoing wood, a lord of nature weeping to a tree. I live between the heron and the wren, beasts of the hill and serpents of the den. What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? The day's on fire. I know the purity of pure despair, my shadow pinned against a sweating wall. That place among the rocks, is it a cave or winding path? The edge is what I have. A steady storm of correspondences, a night flowing with birds, a ragged moon, and in broad day the midnight come again. A man goes far to find out what he is, death of the self in a long, tearless night, all natural shapes blazing unnatural light. Dark, dark my light, and darker my desire. My soul, like some heat-maddened summer fly, keeps buzzing at the sill. Which I is I? A fallen man, I climb out of my fear. The mind enters itself, and God the mind, and one is one, free in the tearing wind. So I think this does marvelous things with these stanzas. Let's see a little bit how the rhymes are reaching and calling out to each other. We have Emily Dickinson's Sea and Tree, that wonderful, obvious kind of daylit rhyme. But between them, we have shade and wood. This is what I'm talking about with the consonantal rhyme where the vowel goes down and it feels to me like the third of the chord shifting to a minor key. It's going down a half step. Shade is brighter than wood. Shade and wood. And then we have wren, a nice little familiar little monosyllable, and den, a perhaps darker monosyllable. Soul calls out to wall, which is kind of disturbing if you think about it. And you think, again, of these maybe prisoners of Plato's allegory of the cave. We had a wall also in the mind where we don't want to occlude against a wall. Soul and wall, there's a change of vowel sound. Fire, despair. We might expect fire to rhyme with desire. Despair is the first two-syllable rhyme sound, and it's big. It feels big there. Cave rhymes with a verb, have. And here they look like they rhyme perfectly, but they don't. They're a little bit off. Then we have this wonderful, the biggest of the rhyme words, correspondences. We might also think of what a correspondence is. A correspondence is something that is echoing back and that corresponds. It responds together, it echoes together, it corresponds. I think it also perhaps has philosophical implications. Moon is consonantally slant rhymed with again. Correspondences rhymes with what he is, or the as of correspondences rhymes with is, as and is. Is such a tiny and yet such a meaningful and huge monosyllable, rhyming with this enormous correspondences. Night, because of the terroir of English, likes to rhyme with light, but also light likes to rhyme with night. So poems about darkness often bring light into them, and poems about light likes to bring in the darkness. Here we have desire. This is a pretty big word. It's as big as despair. Desire, though, rhymes not with fire, but with fear. We expect it to rhyme with fire, but here it rhymes with fear. The fly rhymes with the eye. Which eye is I? So says the fly. And then the mind, which is both maybe a kind of, it's a noun, it's a thing, it's a concept, rhymes with this abstract, concrete yet not concrete thing, the wind. And here, I think especially because we are in an Elizabethan form, I'm going to call that a grandfathered in rhyme, the way Shelley can rhyme behind and wind and wind, so we can here rhyme mind and wind. So I think this poem is definitely feeling its way into the darkness. I'd like to actually close by going backwards and rereading the Emily Dickinson poem, and we'll see if we understand it any better and if we understand the rhymes, and I will just close on that. We grow accustomed to the dark when light is put away, as when the neighbor holds the lamp to witness her goodbye. A moment, we uncertain step for newness of the night, then fit our vision to the dark and meet the road erect. And so of larger darknesses, those evenings of the brain, when not a moon disclose a sign or star come out within, the bravest grope a little and sometimes hit a tree directly in the forehead. But as they learn to see, either the darkness alters or something in the sight adjusts itself to midnight and life steps almost straight.